Okay. Well, we have personally one of my favorite topics because I think Kotev and Mochek, even though it's given relatively short shrift in the Torah Shulchan Aruch, right? As we see, it's only really a couple seifim that talk about it. Um, I think it's really fascinating from a sort of hermeneutical standpoint, right? That so much of this is a question about what is meaning making and how that relates to our notions of productive labor. And as we'll see next week, this also ends up being one of the most relevant topics if, you don't land on electricity as usher d'oraita, right? Based off of some of the disputes we saw last week, right? If you end up landing on electricity as usher d'Rabbanan, or even the people who say electricity is not inherently usher, it can just do lots of usher things, then it's very relevant the fact that a lot of the problems end up being Kotev related, end up being related to both literal writing and also storage of data and visuals. And so useful to be holding in. So we will
And
begin in the first
actually,
couple.
Rev Moshe seemed to say that exactly point about the microphone, that
Yeah.
it's writing on the microphone.
Yeah, we'll see this. I included I think he in Rabbi Daniel Nevins's broader Tshuva on electricity, I think he has a very useful subsection on Kotev where even those who might not agree with him about his approach to electricity, I think he's pretty thorough in his coverage of what a lot of the Kotev issues are. And again, they end up articulating the issues of storage of data, right? That Kotev is about preserving meaning. And right, so things that capture and store content and meaning seem to fall under this rubric. Um, so I think we'll start off with these first Mishnayot just to sort of ground us. So Noam, do you want to kick it off with reading these Mishnahs?
Sure. כותב שתי אותיות בין בימינו, בין בשמאלו, בין משם אחד, בין משני שמות, בין משני סממניות, בכל לשון חייו. So one who writes two letters, whether it's with your right hand or your left hand, whether it's one kind of letter, is this one kind? Or is a shem a word or a
Yeah.
letter? I'm trying to remember. It's a letter.
Here it means the type of letter, yeah.
Yes, yeah. Whether it's one kind of letter, meaning aleph aleph, or whether it's two kinds of letters like aleph bet, right?
Yeah, obviously we'll see later they're getting into more of the
Um,
details about that, but
right. And Ben Mishneh Samamaniyot. Just remind me what that is again exactly.
so that's anybody remember it's a weird plural word, but have this
Types of dye or ink.
yeah, different types. Even if you write it in two different types of writing materials provided there, as we'll see, some form of lasting writing. So if I write something in red ink and then blue ink or whatever, then I'm still chayav.
Should I keep going in the Mishnah?
Yeah.
Amar Rabbi Yosei, lo chivu shtei otiyot ela mishum roshem shekach hayu kotvin al karshei mishkan leda ezo venzugo. So Rabbi Yossi says that the only reason why they forbade two letters was due to making an imprint or a mark, because in the Mishkan, I read the Rashi on this, they would take down all the krashim, and the way they would know how to put them back up when they set up camp again was that they would be there would be one mark on each of the tablets.
Exactly, right? Which this is a really interesting dispute because as we'll see, we're not getting deep into this in the Gemara. There end up being theoretical applications when it comes to what people will be chayav for, slash how many things they would be chayav for. But a big part of it is also sort of a dispute about what the primary function of kotev is. Does anyone feel like you can articulate sort of the distinction between Rabbi Yossi's understanding of the fundamental problem versus our initial one?
It seems like the Tana Kama has a linguistic conception, right? That Kotev is you're communicating something intelligible in language, Whereas Rebbe Yossi thinks they're like non-linguistic ways of communicating. Like a mark would be that, and you would even be higher for that. So Rebbe Yossi is being machmir relative to the Tanakh.
Right, there's potentially more machmir, and it's also sort of both of them, as we'll see this distinction later on, in contrast to like Hatzar Tzura, like people who are, sorry, in contrast to Sovea, in contrast to coloring, that both of them have to do with something other than aesthetic creation. But the rabbis does seem to be more related to some notion of like meaning making, of like conceptual meaning making, whereas Rabbi Yossi is like a functional meaning making, right? That like this is about like that thing by itself actually means maybe nothing, but it means something when it's paired with that other mark on the other like beam that it's going to go with, right? But one way or another, they're seeing it as like these things joined together create some unit of meaning or function. We'll also see later on there's going to be a dispute about when you have one letter that like is a shorthand for a longer word. It is worth noting that in Hebrew there are no one letter words, right? Like there's again one letter that can be a shorthand, but there's no actual one letter words. And so there are some who've argued that like in a language, because like everyone generally agrees that if you write a word, that's its own coherent unit of meaning. So like if I wrote I in English, there are some people who say like that actually would be chayav because that's a full word in this language.
Even in shorthand in Hebrew, there's usually a chuchuk after the aleph.
Right, it's not just the letter.
That's one thing. Second of all is talking about meaning in itself, and going back to this theme that goes over some place, meaning coming out of context. So that actually, you know, contextually it does something, and it does something. So thank you for that.
Yeah. The one other note I'll make is that the Gemara later on, also this isn't one that we looked at inside, but the Gemara later on clarifies that this Mishnah, when it says whether it's with your right hand or left hand, is referring to an ambidextrous person. But that actually, if you are a righty, if you write with your left hand, it's patur av asor, and vice versa, because that isn't like the normal method of writing, slash it's not as efficient a method of writing. So that's also a meaningful qualification. Okay, and so
I want to add
do you
something to that too. There is new data to show that if you want to keep away from dementia, not such an active question for most people on this. If we keep away from dementia, you should be using your other hand as much as possible. You should make yourself ambidextrous not to do so. In my case, since I'm hooked up to the machine once or twice a week, I have to use not my good hand, but my other hand. Dementia is going far away, at least for a while. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry.
Little side perk. Okay, so Noam, do you want to finish off
Sure.
that section?
Amar Rebbe, Matzinu Shem Katan Mishem Gadol, Shem Shimon Shmuel, Noach mi Nachor, Dan mi Daniel, Gad mi Gadiel. So Rebbe says, like, if you just have a 2-letter inadvertent word that like appears as part of the longer word that you're actually intending, you would be chayav for that. So I think it's another chumrah, I think.
Yeah, but like here, and we'll see the question of how dafka these examples are, but that these examples are all ones where again, you're 2 different letters. The question will become, does it matter that it's 2 different letters, despite what we said earlier in the Mishnah? But that like, even if you didn't write what you fully intended, you wrote a unit, right? You wrote something. And so like, you don't have to have fulfilled your full intended purpose to have done something that's substantive enough to make you chayav. Okay, so that's our first section. The next one is going to give us a bit more about our writing materials. Jacob, do you want to read for us the Hakotev Shtei Otiot?
Sure. Hakotev stay otiot be echad chayav kitab b'dayo b'sam b'sikra b'komos kantom b'chol davar shiroshem al shnei kadle zaviot vel shnei luche pinkas v'hin nagin zemzeh chayav. Someone who writes 2 letters in one act is chayav. And I don't know all the individual definitions, but these are different types of ink.
Yeah, these are also they are elaborated in Gitin, I believe, where they also are like, you just mentioned a lot of these. What are the names of some of these things? So, right, Dio is the sort of more classic form of like writing ink. Sam, I mean, it literally means like a poison, but it's also a type of like paint. Secra is like a red paint specifically. Homos is like a ink prepared with like resin or like gummy material. And then Kankantum is it's made with vitriol, sulfate. Okay, yes. Anyhow, you don't need to memorize all of those. They're all types of like inks made with different materials, but they're relatively effective, visible, lasting inks. So if you write with any of those,
and anything that makes an impression onto like wall corners, I guess, and onto like tablets of like keeping receipts, record tablets essentially, and they're used with each other, one would be chayav.
Right, or literally nehagin zaimza is like they're next to each other, like they're read together. I.e., like this is the corner. I'm trying to think of how I can demonstrate this. But like there's a letter here and there's a letter here. And like even though they're on 2 different walls, they're still adjacent to each other such that you could read them together.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hakotev al bisaro chayav. Hamisrita bisaro Rabbi Yezer Mechayev Chatat Rabbi Hoshua Poter. So one who writes on his skin is chayav. One who scratches on his skin, Rabbi Eliezer makes him chayav chatat, and Rabbi Yeshua makes him patur abalasor.
So again, we'll see also this notion of scratching on non-skin that comes up later, but everyone agrees that if you're like writing with a normal writing material on skin, that you're chayav, which will play into the sort of first question that we're going to come up with, which is the element of like how lasting does writing have to be for you to be liable. And now in this last section, we're giving some of the exceptions. Again, some of these are sort of the inverse of what we just stated. But Reuven, do you want to read Ktav Mashkin?
I would be happy to. Okay. Ktav Mashkin b'meferot ba'avak drachim ba'avak hasofrim u'v'chol davar she'eno mitkayem patur. So if you write in a liquid or fruit juice or the dust from a road dust, or a scribal dust that I think was used to dry ink after they had used it to write, or anything that's not long lasting, then you're exempt. And I'm assuming this is patur v'alasor.
Correct. Yes. Again, we'll see the Ramah directly quoting this principle later on in the sheet, but other than in 3 cases in Hilchot Shabbat, the general principle is that when it says patur, it means patur v'alasor.
Right. Okay. Okay. La'achayado biraglo b'fiv ove mar peko katav otachat samuch lichtav uchtav al gabei chtav nitkaven lichtov chet v'chatav shnei zaynin echad ba'aretz ve'echad b'korah katav al shnei chatlei habayit al shnei dapei pinkas ve'ein negin ze im ze patur. So if you write with the back of your hand, or with your foot, or with your mouth, or with your elbow, I think, and then if you write a letter that is sort of adjoining to or adjacent to a letter that you'd already written, I think that's what ot achad samuch lichtav means.
Yeah, one that already exists.
When that already exists. If you write on top of, if you write something on top of something that was already written, if you meant to write a chet, but you wrote two zayins next to each other, if you wrote one thing on the ground and one thing on a beam, if you wrote on two adjoining walls of a house, or on two parts of a
Or-
pinkas.
Well,
Sorry.
two walls of a house. What was the case where we said you're chayav about that?
If there's one letter on one side and the other on the other.
Right, if they're in a corner and they're next to each
In the
other. So
corner,
if that's when you're chayav, what would this be?
If they're maybe across from one another, or
Yeah, or even potentially if they're on walls that adjoin, but not at the place
It's
where
not.
they adjoin, right? That like they're written on separate walls, not adjacent to one another.
right, okay. Oh, sorry, I was up to the Shnei Dapei
I think
Pinkas, right?
Al-Shnei.
Yeah, if you write them on two parts of a Pinkas, a writing tablet that are the ein nogin zeh im zeh, that are not read together, then you're patur. And then the last piece here, Katav Odachat Notarikon Rabbi Yoshua ben Betera Mechayev v'Chachamim Potrin. I think this means if you write one letter that's like some sort of abbreviation, then Rabbi Yoshua ben Betera says you're chayev, but the sages say you're patur.
Right. So if you like write a reish to mean rabbi, or you write a hey to mean Hashem, etc. Right. So what are some of the principles
Lexie,
here
I'm gonna ask
between?
you, Lexie, are you going to talk about disappearing ink?
I will. We sure will. I even
Okay,
have
fine.
the
Just wanna make
Shab 8 linked on our source sheet.
Okay, got it.
Never you fear. But so Reuven, what are some of the principles you'd say behind these different exemptions in our Mishnah?
So the first one seemed to be about how they're not Makayim, so they're not going to last very long at all. If you write something with fruit juice, it might not even last more than a minute. Or if you write something in a very unusual way, that's not the normal way of writing, which would be like using a shinui, or the thing that not the manner in which you write it, but the thing that you've written doesn't really count as two distinct letters, like you're tracing something that's already been written, or what you're doing is not really two sort of brand new, never existed before letters together. And then the last part about the walls and the pinkas, I guess the idea is you're writing two things, but they're not going to be read together. They're not going to count as like a single unit. Maybe that's the idea.
Yeah, this is sort of the inverse of the principle we saw before, which was they were like, if you write two letters on not on the same material, but on adjacent material such that they're read together, you're chayav. So the inverse of that is if it's on different materials and they can't be read together or brought together, then you're not chayav.
So in that way, they're not really a single unit of meaning. They're like two distinct to be one unit of meaning.
Exactly. And then the notricon, again, it's one letter, which gets an interesting concept like there, like if it's not a letter that like by itself, like is actually, if it weren't within this larger context of meaning where I know that is shorthand for something else, that's not inherently like a reish by itself. If it wasn't like reish and then a name, I would not assume that a reish means rabbi, right? But on the other hand, in context, like it absolutely can mean that. So if I only wrote the one word, like one letter, which by itself out of context has no meaning, but in this context, I actually does symbolize a full word, that's where we sort of have this dispute play out. Also, I think it's worth noting again with like all of the abnormal forms of writing, part of what I think the relevance of the abnormality is that like you can't write like productively in that fashion, right? If I needed to write like an urgent note, to somebody, I could write like a few words like this, or with the pen in my mouth or something like that. But I couldn't like write up a speech or an essay or a book in with my bad hand or with a pen in my mouth, right? Like I actually just wouldn't be able to write something that is like a productive unit. I could at most, again, like I could write something that is significant enough that it would still be usher to do b'chachila, if not for other extenuating circumstances. But I'm not really able to do significant labor in writing in any of those fashions, similar to carrying, right? We also say that if you carry like on your elbow, then it's patora valasor, because like you can't carry like you maybe carry like I don't know, a scarf like that or some other small item. You can't carry like a load in that way or in your mouth. So part of it is kind of like what level of labor can you do when it's abnormal?
Do you
Okay.
think that's particular to writing, or you think that all malachot, when
No,
you
I
do
think
the
it's with all
shinui?
melachot. I think, like, in my opinion, I think that that's like part of the basic underlying principle of shinui. Like, it's not just, I don't think shinui is just like a heker. I think it's that part of why it like knocks it down a level is that genuinely you just aren't able to do this malacha in its most effective or productive fashion when you are doing it with a genuine shinui. I just think this is a particularly useful example for that. Okay. So our first sort of subcategory we're going to look at is in fact exactly related to what Rav Landy's mentioned, which is how long does the writing last, right? The question of katiba shel kaima. We've seen that there is this principle of it has to be like something that is somewhat lasting.
I keep on interrupting. You just made a very good chiddush. In my mind, I just got to see how it plays out elsewhere. It sounds terrific, but it's like it's such a good chiddush that we have to see how it plays out other places. That's all I want to say. Makes sense to me. Okay, I'm sorry for interrupting.
People want to do a more systematic go through the malacha, happy to do so. I do think that like this one in carrying are some of the most like obvious literal like because it has to do with like your hands. So I think it's easiest for people to like envision what it means to do that abnormally, as it were. But also like right when it comes to things that we say like aren't like derech bishul or something like that also, right? That like this is a bit different. There's the things of saying it's not derech kativa or derech blank, but that's also generally when we're making categories, we often lump that into the sort of notion of shinoi, i.e. this isn't the normal way of doing this thing, right? So like I could maybe if it's really hot, it's going to be incredibly hot here. I'm in New York. Tomorrow it's going to be like 102 degrees, and that's not real feel. Real feel will probably be in some parts of the city like 110 degrees, right? And so I imagine some of the areas of the city with no shade, like you could cook an egg, out like on the if I put a plate out and I left it outside for long enough. But I couldn't like cook a meal in like by like putting the things out in the sun like that. Right? Like I could maybe cook a somewhat watery egg, but like I couldn't make a meal by that level of heat. So I think the concept plays out. But yes, so one of the things we already saw the idea that like the kativa has to be lasting for you to be chayav, but obviously that's a sort of vague category. So these sources are going to be trying to play out like how lasting is lasting. So Mim, do you want to read for us the Rambam, this Mishnah Torah?
Sure, give me a moment. Yeah. אין הכותב חייב עד שיכתוב הדבר השם, ועומד כגון דיו ושחור וסקרה וקומוס וקנקנטום וכיוצא בהן. שמקיים הכתב עליו כגון אור וקלף ונייר ועץ וכיוצא בהן. אבל הכותב בדבר שאין רישומו עומד כגון משכין ומי פירות, או שכתב בידיו וכיוצא בו על עלי ירקות ועל כל דבר שאינו עומד פטור. אינו חייב עד שיכתוב בדבר העומד על דבר העומד. וכן אין המוחק חייב עד שימחק כתב העומד מעל דבר העומד. You're only chayav if you write something lasting using something lasting and if either your surface or your sort of writing implement, like ink type thing, doesn't last, then you're pater, and the same for erasing.
Right. So the main thing, like the Rambam is sort of adding for us the surface question, because we didn't really see that explicitly mentioned in the Mishnah, but like it's an intuitive connection, right? Saying that like, okay, if we care about the material in which it's written, the principle seems to be, is it like visible and lasting? And so that will also, the question of its lastingness will change depending on what you wrote it on. Great. But now we're going to see the Rashba, who I didn't bring, for the sake of brevity, I did not bring us directly any sections from Gittin. If we were doing this more in a Gemara way as opposed to the Halacha way, I absolutely would have, because there's really interesting crossovers between the two. Because in Gittin, there's also a lot of questions about like the nature of writing and what constitutes writing and what constitutes the witnesses effectively writing something, etc. And so there's a lot of crossover and interesting cases of like, how much can the things that we saw in one section be mapped onto the other? And then there's also this question from Shabbat, right? So the background for this Rashba is actually something from a sugya that a few of us were learning with Rav Landis in a different shir about saving sacred scrolls from a fire, and the question of like, which scrolls do you save? So in the Gemara, the sugya suggests that maybe something that's written in Lashon HaKodesh, but in the materials of like Sam and Sikra and Kankantum, you wouldn't save because they're like lo mekayim, right? It's Lashon HaKodesh, but because they're not lasting, you wouldn't be obligated to save them, or maybe couldn't save them. So the Rashba is going to try and map this onto our question. So Josie, do you want to read the Rashba for us?
Sure. Hada amrinan hani mile b'dio de mekayim aval hacha keva de lo mekayim lo. So we're talking about, he starts off, we're talking about things that are mekayim, that have some sort of lasting value. But if it's not going to be mekayim, it's not going to last for some length of time that we haven't defined yet. We're still trying to figure out what this permanence is. Kashali.
Well, right, but again, the background here is that that's a quote from the the Gemara in Shabbat, where it's saying that like these scrolls written in like Kankantum, Sam, and Sikra, like Hacha Kevan Delo Makayim lo, right? Since they're not Makayim, you don't need to save them. And now the Rashba explains our issue.
Kashali. Dehani nami Makayim Eshahari Shaninu Lamala Baperak Haboneh. Kaf Dalet Amud Bet. Dehakotev Shabbat Deachad Me'elu Chayav. So this is a problem, because if you were, we explained above that if you were to write on Shabbat in this fashion, in one of these ways, you'll be chayav.
Right, Deachad Me'elu, with one of these, what are we referring to here?
I believe we're talking about the inks.
Right, all these different weird inks, right? The ones like the red dye and the like one made from gum, etc.
Which are all listed together as things that are, I mean, they're all listed as part of the same line in the Mishnah. Dio, Sam, Sikra, Kunkantum. Right, so
exactly.
So we're assuming they're all one class of permanent dyes or inks or something similar. Right?
Right.
Shabbat be'achad me'elu chayav b'ta'ama lefi shehi melechet kayemet. Uvehetya Tanya b'tosefta Allah. Zehaklal. So we have a tosefta that says Zehaklal katav davar shel kayama b'davar she'eno shel kayama, or davar she'eno shel kayama b'davar shel kayama patur. Ad shichtov davar shel kayama b'davar shel kayama. So we have this tosefta that gives a generic rule that it has to have both of these properties. It must be a permanent ink on a permanent item, which is, I imagine, where the Rambam gets his, you have to write it on a permanent thing.
Right, because we said the Mishnah didn't explicitly, when talking about writing, it didn't explicitly use the language of Shel Kaima, and it didn't talk about materials, but here it laid that out. So Alma
Alma Hani Nami Mekayami. V'yesh lamar d'mekayme k'tzat ad shedarkan shel b'nei adam lechtov bahen dvarim she'enan asuyin l'kayim al le'olam ele zman echad kesifrei hazichronot k'yotze bahen. So the idea here is that even you could say that even if it's something that we would be writing only for temporary use, like Sifrei Zichronot, I imagine, are like receipts.
Yeah, I'm actually not totally sure the specific context he's referring to, but some kind of thing, like I think that's a good call, even though I do think the Pinkas is maybe more directly related to that, because that's often related to like shopkeepers. So some other sort of thing though, that like, as we'll see someone later on reference, is like not necessarily meant to be like a book, but are meant to be things that can be whatever, that can remind us of things, at least for some medium amount of time.
V'hilchach le'inyan Shabbat melechet machshevet hi, ava le'inyan Sfarim deva'enan davar hamitkayim le'olam hani lo mekayim. So these would be things that you might that are sort of counted among melechet machshevet, but they're not actually meant to be permanent. They're not. We're not writing things that we require permanence for. And so I'm not quite sure exactly how to phrase this. So we're talking about something that's lasting, but not necessarily lasting to the extent of these svarim that go on forever, like that are meant to last for the olam le'ad olam.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the matter of books, right, or like holy books, this is considered to be a sort of intermediate category of they sort of last, but they don't fully last, right? But that this is, I think, actually, it maps really well for those people who have been with us for Isser V'Heter. The Rashba, in a couple different places, makes a sort of chiluk like this, where there's a certain concept that seemingly would be applicable from one area of halacha to another. And the Rashba says, no, actually, there's different considerations at hand in those two different areas of halacha, and so we can't just apply it in the same way, right? So in like Isser V'Heter versus Shabbat, there's the question of like a kli rishon, kli sheni, etc., right? Where for the purposes of Shabbat, we say kli sheni enu mavashel, right? Like once you're out of the kli rishon, if you're just in a kli sheni and beyond, it doesn't cook. That's not considered cooking for the purposes of Shabbos. And so a lot of people, the Tosfot in particular, apply that to the issues of Isser V'Heter as well when it comes to when does something absorb flavor, right? That they say in the Kli Sheni, bli'ah, like this absorption doesn't occur. But then the Rashba says, no, that's silly, right? Like there's a difference between the standard of what constitutes cooking as a labor you did on Shabbos versus what's the material reality in which things are hot enough that flavor will pass from one thing to another. And he says, if it's Yad Solet Bo, if it's that level of hot, it doesn't matter how many kalim it's gone between. It's still going to absorb flavor, right? He's like, the metric is different for these two different things because the thing we care about is different, right? So too here, he's like, in the sugya later in Shabbos, the one about saving scrolls, what matters is like, is this a scroll that will last indefinitely, right? If it's something that in some matter of days or weeks or months might fade, then it's not considered to be sort of chashuv or permanent enough that we save it from a fire. But for the purposes of Shabbos, when it comes to like, have you done something productive and significant? It doesn't have to be something that will last forever or indefinitely. It just has to last some significant amount of time, right? And so he's like, these other weird inks, the kankantum, the komos, etc., they last long enough that you've done something very clearly productive that you can use if you've written them on Shabbos, even if you wouldn't want to write a book in that. Which is also probably why these are not kosher generally for the gets you're supposed to write in Dio for the most part. Rav Nachum, is that a hand or no?
Well, I think it's very interesting comparison you're making. Very interesting. This case is even more extreme than the other, because in the other case with the Klisheni, the Rashba says like Nehi de Klisheni Eino Evashel Umafli Umavliya. Even though it's true. He says the term Eino Evashel, it's true even by Isra Heter. It's just, but we don't care only about Bishul. Here he's even more extreme because he's saying the term, this very self-same term, Bar Kaima, itself has various meanings in two different meanings in two different contexts, which I think is 100% correct. But it's more striking because he's a lot of times people say, a lot of learners will say, oh, this same term, let's see every place where this term appears, it's got to mean the same thing. And no, the same term can mean different things in different contexts, which is a very, I think, correct in this case. And I don't know how to say it, but like, it's not stiff. It's not a stiff way of learning. I think it's correct.
Yeah, I think that like his distinction feels like a very intuitive one. Like, I think it makes a lot of sense that based off of what we care about in those two cases, even though in both ones, to some extent, the language of like, yeah, like Shalkaima or Mekayim is being used, the language of like what level of lasting it is that we're referring to and that we care about being different makes a lot of sense. Noam?
I'm also interested, it's interesting that the example he's giving of Mekaimiksat as like these things that seem to be written for some kind of an economic purpose. And like, if I'm not mistaken, I'm not totally sure, but like this might be a Chiddush, because like in the Mishnah, like, and the Tosefta, like it seemed like maybe we were always talking about material reality as something that persists, but now it actually seems like he might be talking about like the content and the purpose of writing. I don't know if I'm being clear, but there's a way you could read the Rashba here that he's also talking about material reality. Like if you're writing a note to yourself or whatever, you're going to write it in a certain way that it will last a little bit of time. But maybe he's actually just talking like, okay, I'll need this for the quarter. I'm not going to need it indefinitely, but I need it like for a few weeks or a few months to do my bookkeeping. So anyway, that's interesting.
Yeah, I think especially depending on, I would love to do a deeper dive into what the more literal thing is he's referring to with the Sefer Zichronot, because that could be like an interesting.
I have a hunch. I have a hunch that he's talking about. There's a thing called a Zichron Devarim. Before you make a contract, you write what's called a Zichron Devarim, which is just like I don't know how you say it in English, but like a pre-contract contract. It's not the final contract. It's just like notes that we agreed. This is what we said, and we agreed on this. And then later, the lawyer will write the contract.
Yeah, it's an outline. It's a sketch. It's yeah.
Yeah, but in Hebrew it's called Zichron Devarim. I think that's what he means by phrase Zichronot.
Well, you write a short. Whenever I used to do a chuppah, I would write down on a piece of paper the names of the chassan and kala. That's in the case of the ones I know very well. The easiest for me to do is say dear chassan, dear kala, but it's nice to say people's names. It's not meant for a long time. You don't do weddings on Shabbos. I just took a look at my Sefer Zichronos here, and I can't read anything I wrote because it was like, by something of soy milk and all that. So I think there's already a safe there. So it's a little bit, but nonetheless, it's what old-fashioned technology.
Right, like it's the old-fashioned version of your notes app in a way. Although arguably, again, with the technology, your notes app could last a very long time.
But this has a legal standing. When you buy an apartment, you make a Zichron Devarim. You make something that there's an official agreement to buy. It's an agreement. It's like as opposed to a contract, but it's an official thing. And I think that's what he's referring to. He's saying this official legal document could actually be written in this kind of ink because it's not meant to be a final contract. I'm just trying to give it
needs to last
more
for some. Right, it needs to last for
it has
some substantive period of
significance.
time.
It doesn't last long.
He's not just talking about notes.
Right.
Yeah, but we'll see again that like certainly in our later sources, people understand this as being like not something that vanishes like in a day or in 2 days or something like that. It lasts for a longer period of time.
But it
So
seems that
now,
it needs to last long enough to meet a purpose, as opposed to Sefer Kodesh, where the purpose is ongoing. Here, I've got a letter of intent, a Sefer Zichron, or is some other notes that need to last long enough for me to make it permanent. So we
yeah,
have this
like,
notion of like it's sagi, it's enough.
right, long enough that you've accomplished something concrete. Which again is different than long enough that you've like made a permanent record of some book or the like.
Which
Okay,
ties
this might be emphasizing kavana.
That's just what I was trying to say before, that the words weren't really coming. But anyway.
Yeah, I think he's sort of doing a bit of both, right? Both talking about like how long do we objectively see that these inks last amount of time. People write things like, they're not like vanishing ink, right? Like these don't just like go away. So he's like, materially we see that these aren't like super, they're not like May-Pei-Rots, right? They're not like those things that would just like and at the same time, the notion of mentioning it's like Sifrei Zichronot does seem to indicate also this question of like purpose and form and intent, as well as the literal physical reality. So I agree that I think both of those things are happening. So now we have the Bior Halacha, who's going to map this onto some more contemporary inventions. So Max, if you can read this, the first couple lines are actually just him summarizing the Rashba. So if you see 4 lines down where it says Ulefize.
Yeah, okay. Ulefize, nireh pashut, hakosev bekli oferes hanahug kihayom, bein hasochorim, lachtzov bahen, cheshbonosehen, lizicharon chayav. Velo dam mize lekosev be'ever, d'mevuar sham begin, delo chashiv kasav midoraisa, da'chazina debekli oferes rishumo nikar umiskayem. Va'af bekosev bepecham me'urav b'mayim, mashma begamar dechayav chatas, ve'kol shekein bazeh shemiskayem yoser. So writing in, with a lead pencil or something like that, that counts as kaima, because that's what's happening, because you make a noticeable mark and it lasts, and even if you mix like coal or something like that with water, that doesn't make it any better for you, and it might even be worse because it lasts longer.
I think he's saying kol shekain bezeh. He's saying we saw the like, if you mix a coal with water, the Gemara implies that when it's chayav, and he's like kol shekain here, like a lead pencil, basically. He's like, that's actually more lasting and effective than mixing a coal with water, right? So again, he's like, lead pencils, they might not be the same level of permanent as like fancy ink, but it lasts a while, right? And this also, I would say, bolsters your point, Rav Nachum, that like he seems to be comparing this notion of like the Socharim, who are like behen cheshbonotehan the zichron, that like writing up, again, receipts, sort of, at least for a shorter period of like documentation and memory, that like they do that with pencil and it lasts long enough for their purposes. And so you're chayav. Okay, but now we'll see an interesting other Rambam besides one we saw earlier that sort of complicates things for people a little bit. So that was pretty short. So Max, do you want to read this Rambam as well?
Yes. Sorry, I don't.
Did you add the Rambam since sending it to
Oh,
us?
yes. If you're not online, yes, it's on the document online.
Okay, let me just pull up your doc.
The top of the second page.
Hilchot Shabbat Perek Tet Halacha Yud Gimel.
Got it. Okay. Hatzovei Achut, that's the one.
Exactly.
Okay. Hatzovei Achut she'arko arba'at tfachim o davar she'efshar litvos mimenu chut kazeh chayav. So if someone dyes a string that is 4 tfachim, or that can be used to weave into a string, That's a string that's that size, chayav.
Spin, I think he means like
Yeah.
the
to, like,
raw
spin
wool
out
to
into
spin
string.
it into a string.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
The einat tzoveh chayav ad shehei tseva hamiskayem. So it needs to be material that lasts. Aval tzava she'ino miskayem klal kagon shehe'avir sarak o shashar al gebe barzel o nechoshes utzva'o patur. But if it's any kind of dyeing that doesn't last, like something that you would do onto some side copper or iron, that's patur. Don't know exactly what these.
Yeah, the sarak, I believe, is another type of like red dye. I would have to double check the exact type. I don't remember what shashar is, but can also double check. But
I
in
looked
either
it up
case,
and it's also
I always
red.
thought this referred to kind of like a rust that you have on Dyson.
Wait, I looked it up and it said
Okay.
like, what's the word? Vermilion, something like that.
cool. Okay, vermilion or this other type of red on like iron or copper, that's not going to last long enough. Because like again, the whatever, it's much harder to have lasting colors on metals. So then these last couple lines are going to be sort of the most relevant.
Okay, shaharei atama aviro l'shaso ve'eno tzoveh klum. V'chol she'in melachto miskayemes b'Shabbos patur. So you are doing it only for a temporary period, and you're not really dying. And we have this principle that anything that doesn't last, it doesn't rise to the level of the chatas.
It sounds to me like a
Okay.
chalkboard. It's like a chalkboard. It's like writing with a material that just comes off. You have instead of a chalkboard, it's an iron board, and you're writing with this dye, and you can just spray water. It just washes right off.
Well, but I don't know. I mean, because again, there's a question of like how easily could something be washed off versus like is something automatically gonna kind of vanish if you don't try to? I think those are also interesting
Well,
questions.
he
Is
writes,
it like
"Shaharei atama viro l'shato." You remove it at its destined time, at your intended moment. You remove it.
Yeah, I think
It
that
doesn't leave any lasting impression.
yeah, I think that's fair. I think that also like he's saying potentially that like yes, if it's something that could be similarly but also whiteboard, that if you could get rid of it, that does seem to be a point actually with that language, that probably dry erase markers are even better, that if it works well, I feel like chalkboards,
Well,
depending on the
chalkboards have
quality of the
other problems than
chalkboard,
the
it leaves a
chalk,
little bit more.
and
Sure,
also the
yeah.
chalk
But with
itself
the
is
dry
probably.
erase markers, yeah, if they're not like a really old whiteboard, like you can erase it and there's no indication that that ever existed.
Well, actually,
So that's an
as a teacher, I can
interesting
tell you
finish.
that if they don't erase it within 2 weeks,
Oh, after a while, it really
will
sticks.
stick
Yes,
there. So
correct.
that might be
Difference between
different, actually.
There's a difference between
I
dry erase markers and chalk, because with chalk, you're actually grinding a piece of material.
Yeah, I didn't mean to
Right.
say that using chalk would be mutter, but I just meant to say from the concept of writing, it wouldn't be called writing in this context. But it would be also for other reasons.
But again, this does seem to be like it's an interesting potential chiddush, right? The question of like how much is it about like how something will inherently remain, like whether something will automatically start breaking down versus like how long something like how something could easily be removed.
Wait, can I
Whether
just
it
say one
like
more thing?
automatically has a lasting imprint.
I misspoke here. We're not talking about writing particularly. I think we're talking about a
I
different
mean, here he's
malacha,
talking about
dye.
dying. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this might not be
Yeah,
relevant to writing.
No, so to be clear, the Barzell thing is not our main interest here. It's really the last line that is going to be relevant. Which now we're going to see in the Minchas Shlomo, right? So this is Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who is getting into this question of again, how long does something have to last for it to be mitkayemet? Ori, are you readable or no?
I could try. I've got my son here, so.
So maybe try and do the first paragraph for us. Just the af shali chora. This second page, Shut Minchat Shlomo.
Oh, I got it. Okay. אף שלכאורה היה נראה שהטעם שצריכים דווקא כתיבה מתקיימת הוא משום דבעינן דומי דמשכן. Right, so it seems that the original reason that it has to be really lasting writing is because this was what it would have been like in the Mishkan. וכיוון דכתיבה הייתה שם כדי שלא יתחלפו סדר הקרשים, right? Right, so it was because we were marking the different, what's a good word for krashim? Those pillars of the walls.
So
that
they're
they
from
had-
like beams.
Right, the beams had to meet at the right place, sort of like modern day sukkahs. Some people's sukkahs. Hayuvadei makpidim shitkayim nizman merubeh. It had to last actually a pretty long time so that you could match it, next time you're building your mishkan. ולא סגי כלל במה שיכול להתקיים רק בשבת או ליום אחד בלבד, so it wouldn't have been enough if it would only last for a Shabbat or for a day. לכן נראה מלשון הרמב"ם
בפרק י"א.
מהלכות שבת, הלכה ט"ו, עד שיכתוב בדבר רושם ועומד. Until you write with something that makes a mark and lasts, כגון דיו, like ink. ולא הזכיר כלל שיעור שלא פחות מיום אחד, and didn't mention, an amount of time like less than a day, כמו שכתב בתחילת דבריו, like he mentioned earlier on. אך כנים הם דבריו שמהרמב"ם
והמגיד משנה.
מגיד משנה בפרק ט', הלכה ג' משמע דשפר חייב אם מתקיימת בשבת.
Right, what is the implication of that last
like,
line?
yeah, right. It seemed like that you would be chayav if it lasts just for the Shabbat.
Right, if it lasts for the rest of Shabbos, right? He was like, any malacha that is she'ein malachta mitkayemet b'Shabbat patur. The inverse of that is if it's mitkayemet b'Shabbat, it implies that he's chayav. And even though he was saying this in response to the tzovea, he said kol malacha, right? He's expanding that seemingly to all categories. So it seemed to imply like something that you write that would last to the end of the day, that would be lasting enough to be chayav, right? Okay. Vegam ra'iti b'mishnah brura.
Did you skip down a little? אף שלעניות דעתי צריך עיון, וכי ששער על גבי ברזל ונחושת, אי אפשר שיתקיימו אפילו יום אחד בלבד. Even there, it wouldn't even last a day. ובפרט שגם המנחת חינוך בקונטרס נר מצווה, עוד כ"א, והחמדת ישראל הבינו כך. ורם מה שכתב שם, I didn't know this one.
A lot of this is mostly citations in response to one or the other. I don't think
Okay, he starts to mention
he picks up with, I think, a new
foods.
thing about like, if you see Gam Ra'iti b'mishnah brura, b'shar hatzion.
Yeah, גם ראיתי במשנה ברורה בשער הציון, סימן ש"ג עוד ס"ח. דסובר נמי בדעת הרמב"ם. It also holds like the Rambam. דלא פטור, אלא כשאינו מתקיים כלל, אפילו יום אחד. So you're only chayev. Sorry, you wouldn't be patur. Sort of says this backwards. You'd be chayiv if it lasts a day.
It's a double negative that you're only putter, you're like that one is not putter, or I guess lo putter ella. One is only putter if it doesn't last a full day. Right? I.e., again, if it lasts till the end of Shabbos, the Mishnah Berurah seems to agree, right? That like, or at least this commentary there, that according to the Rambam, at the very least, if it lasts a day, you're chayav. So that's like, Auerbach is saying that does appear to be the pshat of the Rambam from this other bit in, Perek Tet. But he has some comments and critiques. So do you feel up to reading another paragraph?
Yeah, just help me understand where we're up to. So basically, we have a shiur of a day.
Yes, that he's already presented two kind of different views. The first one is he said it seems like the origin of why we would need something to be mitkayemet is that it's like, ke'en, like similar to how it functioned in the Mishkan. And the way it functioned in the Mishkan would clearly have had to be for weeks or months at the very least, right? For it to be relevant when they're disassembling and reassembling the Mishkan, if not years, but definitely at least like months, right? And so that would seem to be the paradigm of why we need something to be lasting, which would indicate like some significant amount of lastingness. But he's also pointed out that it does appear to be the pshat of the Rambam, at least the Rambam in Perek Tet, that if something lasted even till the end of Shabbos, that would be lasting enough to be chayav. So we have this tension between sort of different views of how mekayem something has to be. So now he's going to cite the Rashba that we just saw.
Okay, מהרשב"א בשבת קט ו' המובא בביאור
הלכה,
סימן ש"מ סעיף ד' דיבור המתחיל במשכין נראה שסובר את האף שאין צריכים שיתקיים לעולם, so we don't need that it lasts forever, אבל צריכים על כל פנים שיתקיים זמן חשוב. It should have to last a certain, like a significant, might be a way to think of חשוב.
Yeah.
Significant amount of time. Kevin Zakarin, Sefer Zichronot, right? Even those memos are called Sefer Zichronot, which means you got to remember it for a certain period of time that's significant. ואין רגילים כלל לכתוב זיכרון בדיו. And they weren't writing those memory notes with ink. או על דבר שמתקיים רק יום אחד ולא יותר. Not right now. We're at camp, so we have gone coming up. על דבר שמתקיים רק יום אחד ולא יותר. Okay. So even if it's not ink, it's still something that's lasting long enough to serve its purpose. ומסגנון הדברים משמע שגם המשנה ברורה הבין כן. ועיין גם בנשמת האדם, כלל, כ"ד, דיבר מההתחלה אבל, שכתב דהה אין דרך לכתוב אלא כדי שיעמוד לזמן מרובה. So it's talking about any kind of writing that it's meant to last a significant amount of time. I mean, that language sounds a little longer, mirubeh.
I mean, mirubeh, chashuv, like, again, we're already seeing some sort of vagueness. Like, obviously, part of the appeal of the Rambam Shita is that it's more delimited, right? It's like, it gives you a bit of a clearer boundary. Like, yeah, if it lasts a day, that's lasting. Congratulations, right? So it's more machmir, but it gives you a clearer boundary. Whereas like once you get into the realm of like, oh, it lasts a significant period of time, that itself is like a bit difficult. If people remember back with when we did like kosher and matir, there was the question of like, with the knots needing to last some length of time and how much of it was like the type of the knot versus the intent, and was a long time like a week or was it like a month, that these questions do get a little thorny. But still, he's saying that the pshat of several of these sources seems to be that it has to be a substantive amount of time that is certainly more than a day, right? So Gama Kotev B'dio.
But aren't we seeing a machloket here? It seems like a machloket. It seems like the Mishnah Brura is understanding that you could be it could be even chayiv if it's less than a day, and the Chayei Adam is saying no, it has to be zman merubeh, like a day or two.
No, the Mishnah Brura elsewhere, he's saying that the Mishnah Brura seemed to understand the Rambam as saying that you're chayav if it lasts for a day. But the Mishnah Brura understands like the Rashba and these other sources as saying that it has to excuse me, last some significant period of time. He's just citing the way that the Mishnah Brura basically has understood these other sources.
You're saying chashuv is more than less than a day?
Yes.
I understood chashuv to mean not a minute, but like less, but like a few hours.
No, I think again, since he's comparing this to like saying this from the Rashba and the Sefer Zichronot, and he's putting this in contrast to what just
No,
happened.
but he says the ein
I think-
regilin klal liktov zikronot b'dio o al davar shemitcayem rak yom echad v'lo yoter. He's saying.
No, he's saying we don't do that. We don't write on something al davar shemit kayem rak yom echad v'lo yoter. It is not normal to write these sort of zichronot on something that would only last a day and not more.
I see what you're saying. Okay, I read it differently. Fine, good.
Right, and so
this
again,
kind of
he's
the
saying
paradigm. It has to last long enough to serve some kind of purpose.
So davar
Yeah.
so chashuv means a few days, and then he quotes the Chayei Adam also saying a few days.
right again. We
Against
don't
the
know if it's a few
Rambam.
days. It might be more than a few days. Like,
Well, I'm
but
reading ahead.
clearly
He says
he's
"Ulai gam gimel o
understanding.
daled."
Yeah, so he's standing. Those first ones just say chashuv merubeh. We don't know how long, but he's clearly rating them as being more than a day. And then he also gives another proof. So gam hakotev b'dio al aleh.
Take that. Yeah. על שבצל וחזרין, דתניא דפטור. We learned that would be patur מפני שאין מתקיים. אינו מתקיים. Right, so that's a Talmudic source that shows us, something that's sort of obviously too temporary, like a onion peel. חושבני דיכול שפיר להתקיים יום אחד. I think that it has to last at least a day.
I think he's not saying has to. He's saying I think it could. Saying I think if I wrote something on an onion peel in ink, that could totally last a day. Right? The onion peel isn't gonna like disintegrate in like 10 hours. Right? Absolutely, that could last till the end of Shabbos, right? Or afilu, ulai gam.
שלושה או ארבעה ימים, ואפילו הכי פטור. And even here you would be patur, like in the case of the batzal. I see. So if we see that you're patur in the case of the batzal, and the batzal would last more than a day, we have at least another source that shows that a couple of days is not considered permanent for the sake of being chayav, at least.
Exactly.
Okay. גם פסק השולחן ערוך שם סעיף ה' שמותר לרשום בציפורן על קלף מפני שאינו מתקיים. So we also see in the Shulchan Aruch that you can mark it with on a cloth, you mark with a fingernail. That's not something that lasts. Av she'inyano
She'einenu.
Oh, av she'einenu ro'ot b'yom echad v'adai yachol litkayem. We know that will last for a day. That's an obvious example of something that lasts for a day. וכן נראה גם ממה שכתב הרמב"ם בהלכה ט"ז, הכותב על בשרו חייב, אף על פי שחמימות בשרו מעברת הכתב לאחר זמן, הרי זה דומה לכתב שנמחק. How does this help him? The Rambam is saying if you write on your skin, even though we know that the warmth of the body is going to take that away after a certain amount of time, that's considered like writing, disappearing ink.
Right, he's now going to explain the argument here.
Choshvani b'kavanatohi kevan shehaya mit. Right, I think he's talking about not living flesh. Haya mitkayem, or sorry, if it was not living flesh, it would last. ורק מפני שהוא חי וחם, לכך החמימות מעברת, right? So in a hypothetical way, writing on skin, it would last. It's just that it happens to be that it would get erased from its warmth.
Right, that it's like sort of not an inherent quality of skin, but of skin on a live person with all the other things that are functioning in your body. But like skin itself as a surface, it could last some length of time. And I was also going to give another, like, here is a piece of evidence from our own experience. הרי עינינו רואות.
והרי עינינו רואות שהחמימות אינה מעברת דיו וסיקרא תוך יום אחד, right? And we know that actually, if you write with ink, it's not going to come off in a day. כי אם לאחר זמן, but actually more time. ואפילו הכי כתב הרמב"ם דאינו מתקיים. And even in this case, the Rambam, he describes it as Zeino Mitkayem. So it's almost like the Afal P of the Rambam. He's using that to make his point, meaning, yeah, you're chayav in that case, even though it's really not permanent. And of course, when it's not permanent, you should be patur. Inference from what the Rambam is saying. So maybe that case is chayav, but another non-lasting case should be patur.
Right, and that we're saying that like his example, even of the one that he's like, oh, something comparable to this, where if it were not for the fact that like on a dead body it would last longer, you would be patur. He's like, yeah, you can totally, again, if you're not like washing your skin, if you like write, if I like write in pen on my arm, that can last for like a couple days. So it's not like inherently that's going to be gone within a day. In the parentheses, he qualifies things a bit. He's like, maybe he's just talking actually, again, about the chiyuv, even though it's within a yom, etc. But all of this, I think we're gonna pause here because he mainly has brought his proofs so far. Ultimately, because of all these proofs that he has brought, Rav Auerbach thinks that, like, yeah, Mitkayem is not one day, right? Like that it has to be, we get into the question of like, they generally kind of say like more than 3 days, they mention later on, even though arguably some people may have been even setting it at a higher amount, but he like puts that as sort of a mark. But he's like 1 day from all of these proofs clearly does not appear to actually be the hard limit. It doesn't really make sense to say that. And that is also how we get the fun innovation. I don't know how many people clicked on the link I put here about the Shabbat. But it's something that people use primarily, as they mention here, primarily people in Sahal or doctors, who, for reasons of like health and safety and whatnot, it's considered to be enough to like do things that are not lechatchila usually ideal, but it's preferable if you're only doing a durabanan, right? And so they write it in essentially like disappearing ink, right? But it's ink that disappears after like a couple days, right? So they write something down, they need to make a note of it, they write it with the Shabbat, and then when Shabbos is over, they copy it in like more lasting ink, but it lasts till the end of Shabbos, right? Dafka, this is only useful because it does last till the end of Shabbos, but not so much longer. So they write it down in that, it'll fade automatically within a couple days, and then they copy it on something that is more lasting, right? So this does end up being generally, I would say the majority of contemporary poskim do sort of agree with Rav Auerbach that like, it doesn't have to just last till the end of Shabbat, that is not our criteria for chiyuv. Noam?
Just a question about the Shuva. Like, if I understood correctly, so he presented at first a very machmir reading of the Rambam, and he has kind of rejected that and suggested a much more makil reading of the Rambam. But he hasn't told us like why the machmir reading is wrong, right? Like the two readings are based on different sources, unless I'm missing something.
I think he hasn't like necessarily dismissed that it is like a very real possibility that the Rambam thinks that it's like that potentially he does ultimately think, or at least one strand of his thought is that it only has to last a day. But he's like, there's actually just enough other sources in poskim contradicting the Rambam that it still essentially overwhelms that shita, right? That
Gotcha.
like
Okay,
even if
that's
we
helpful.
do say the Rambam really thinks it only needs to last a day, he's like, the Tosefta doesn't imply that, the Gemara doesn't imply that, the Rashba doesn't imply that. Like all of these other sources seem to indicate that things can last for a day and still not be Mekayim.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think we will pause here. We'll take a 5-minute break, come back at 3:18, and then I think we might, for time's sake, mostly skip over our Aleph section, even though it is a fun one. We can do some summarizing, and we'll get into cakes and books. Okay, so the section that I think we're sadly going to skip over, but I think is like, again, interesting when it comes to some of the questions we mentioned at the beginning about the sort of meaning-making element, is that there's question about like, if you write two letters that are identical but do not form a word by themselves, are you chayav? Right? That everybody, or sorry, actually not everybody, that a lot of people seem to agree that if you write two letters that are the same and that do form a word, like gag or rar or dad, that those are words, right? So who cares if you wrote two gimels? Like those are in fact words by themselves, and so it works. Even if you were intending to write a longer word. But the question of like, do we say that if you've written two letters, that actually like we meant that sort of bedafka, like if you've written two letters, that's it, that's all we need? Or by two letters, did they indicate that like, actually it has to be something that constitutes like some sort of meaningful unit? So that's something the Mishnah Berurah elsewhere sort of somewhat seems to side. Rashi seems to indicate elsewhere that he maybe thinks if you do write just the Aleph Aleph, that the Tanakhama thinks you would be chayav. But we see from the Rambam, he seems to think it only works if they form a word. So that is our Aleph Aleph section. And now we have a brief bit about sort of the scratching with a nail. So Noam, do you want to read for us the Piskei Tosfot and then the Or Zarua?
Sure. Piskei Tosfot. Ein lishon b'tziparon al sefer v'lo lichtov b'mashkim al gabei shulchan v'lo be'etzba al afar. So you don't mark a book with your nail, and you don't write in drink or in juices on a table, and you don't mark anything in dirt or dust with your finger.
So again, all of these things are stuff where you're patur, as we've seen, but they're saying that it's still usher to do. So now the Or Zarua is going to give us a bit more detail.
ודנה מוקמן בהבונאה המסורת על בשרו רבי אליעזר מחייב חטאת וחכמים פותרים. אבל לכתחילה כולי עלמא אסור. Okay, so we have an habona, that one who scratches their skin, Rabbi Eliezer says you're chayav, Chachamim say you're patur, but lechatchila, everyone agrees that it's asur. Ufiresh Rashi, Hamesaret b'michtav o b'sikra, Hamesaret b'michtav o b'sikra. And Rashi says scratching in writing or in some kind of ink.
Right. Rashi seems to be understanding the Misaret is referring not to just like scratching, but to the idea of like basically making a mark that's not a letter. Right. So Rashi there seems to indicate that like it's specifically when you're doing it with this kind of material that it's patur balasur.
ואמרינן בירושלמי בהבונה הקורע על האור כתבנית כתב פטור. הרושם על האור כתבנית כתב חייב. And we say in the Yerushalmi, one who tears the skin like a pattern, ketavnit, lichtav, like a
Yeah, like in the
pattern,
pattern of writing.
right, then you're patur. But if you mark the skin in the pattern of writing, you're chayav. Hilkach, note bene.
Yeah, I think nun bet. I'm trying to remember. I'm actually not sure what nun bet is.
I remember like sometimes when it appears in like Masarda Shas, like I got into it seemed like it actually does just stand
I
for
think
note
maybe
bene.
nichtav bitzido.
Oh. Hilkach nichtav, which is basically note bene, right? But
Yeah.
hilkach nichtav b'tzido, כשאדם מעיין הלכה בשבת ובא על ליבו שום חידוש שצריך לשאול, שאסור לו לרשום בציפורן על הגיליון, לזכור שלא ישכח מידי דהבה המסרד, הבשרות, אסור לכל העלמא, ורבי יוסי נמי דנימוקו עמו Oser Roshan Ba'alma. So therefore, like when an individual is learning halacha on Shabbat, and it like some chiddush occurs to them that they actually need to ask about to someone, it's forbidden for them to mark with their nail on the publication so that they remember in order to like not forget after Shabbat. And that's similar to one who scratches onto one's skin, which is also patur av asur according to everyone. And Rebbe Yossi also that his justification is with him. Is this like nimuk?
His like, yeah, he has the right rationale.
Mm-hmm. He forbids, right? Rebbe Yossi is machmir, and he forbids just making a mark.
Yeah, nimukoimo is often like a compliment of like they have like the right like sort of svara or dikduk.
I think
but
it
yeah,
means that
this
he
is
has. I think it means that he offers it a reason as opposed to the other one who just makes a pronouncement.
right, that he's giving a rationale behind what is usher
Not
about
that his
this. And again,
rationale is particularly good, but that he has a rationale.
we do also usually say nimuk, like as in I would be interested in doing a deeper survey. I think it is often used dafka also as like a reason to support a particular idea against others, but maybe it's not just like dafka, it's a better rationale, but because they articulate their rationale, that is, helps bolster the idea. One way or another, right? He's saying that like, even if you're not making a letter, right? You're not writing out something, you are like creating again, like by marking something so that you can like look at that and like remember this chiddush that you're going to say. He's like, you're kind of performing a function in a similar way to like Rabbi Yossi's indication of like marking the Krashe HaMishkan, right? That like you're marking this so you're able to identify it for this like purpose, right? Which again, I think the particular idea of like, yeah, especially when you have a chiddush, and so that's why you're marking it. It's not that you're just marking it needlessly because you're like antsy and want to do something, right? There's like a reason for which you're trying to sort of bookmark this page. So again, since it's only one action, we'll see various reasons for why some people might think that it is not usher. Nobody thinks that it's, well, most people don't think that it's chayav, but just making an argument, right, about the sort of like functionality of this. I think for the sake of time, I'm gonna read some of the other ones in this section so we can get into our fun discussion of cakes and books. But the Torah and Shulchan Aruch sort of straightforwardly do not agree, right? They don't paskin by the Or Zarua. They both just say mutar lirshom b'tziporan al sefer kamo sheroshmin l'siman she'en zed davar mitkayem. Right? We saw this already actually cited in the Minchat Shlomo as support for his idea of what mikayem is, right? But they're like, yeah, you can make a little mark with your fingernail on a sefer because like that's not going to last, right? Which is interesting that that's all that they say because obviously it needs to be more than eno mitkayem to be mutar, right? It's the combination of it's like not mitkayem and you're only doing this one mark and you're not doing it like in the normal writing fashion, etc. But the Bach is going to bring up Ori.
Let's just say it's also not a letter. So in the same way that we have a debate about, two letters if it has a meaning or not, like it doesn't, okay, so it's a little debatable if you're symbolizing, come back to this later, but that's not exactly a symbol. It doesn't have a meaning like most kotev. I think that's part of
Yes.
the leniency. And then, yeah. And I like the Pinei Halacha brings the, somehow folding the page is better than marking the page. In the end there.
Yes, we'll get the difference between these two different like forms when it comes to the physicality of what you're doing, right? But also when it comes to when you're not making a letter, we saw with Rabbi Yossi that it's certainly only chayav if you do it, in his opinion, on sort of two different things that are seemingly corresponding, and therefore he says you still need to make two different marks to be chayav. It just doesn't have to be letters. But so the Bach sort of takes the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch to task for just uncomplicatedly saying that this is permitted, right? So he quotes the thing. He says, "V'tamhetzi al horazo halom mifurash beperak haboneh b'birata amar Rabbi Yossi b'chi mishum kotev hu chayav v'halo eno mechayav ela mishum roshem sheken roshmin al kershe hamishkan leda ezahu ben zugo lefichach sarat srita achat al shnei nesarim o shtei sritot al nesar achat chayav." ואף אגב, דהכה מיירי בשתי שריטות ובשריטה שהיא מתקיימת, מכל מקום, איסורה מהאיגה בשריטה אחת, ואפילו אינו מתקיים. Right, he's like, sure, fine, this one isn't lasting in the same way that the ones Rabbi Yossi was talking about, but as we've seen, that only brings you to pator aval asor. That shouldn't bring you, if it's only eino mitkayem, that's the only distinction, that doesn't bring you to mutar, right? Kitan sof perak habona katav mashkin v'chulei ubechol davar she'eno mitkayem pator v'chol b'turei Shabbat pator aval asor bar mitlat k'dita b'sof ha'oreg. Right, so again, he's bringing out that principle we mentioned earlier. It said pator, which means it's pater, but it is forbidden to do. V'od v'iti shekatav maharshal b'hakotav debismak oser l'rshom b'tziporan al sefer. ושמעתי מחכם אחד שהיה מכריע ביניהם ואומר שזה בקלף הקשה וזה בנייר הרך, בסברה נכונה היא עד כאן לשונו. What is this? Something he's talking about his own opinion, but it's just not lefi aniyut dati because there's a kaf. I don't know if people know what the kaf is. Yeah, or lichora, maybe.
Lichora aniyut dati.
But I feel like that's a weird thing. It's like seemingly in my, I guess, yeah, like lichora be'aniyut dati, like whatever, seemingly in my humble opinion, that da'af b'klaf hakasher de'eno mitkayem pator aval asor hu v'af agav di'ika hachat tarte chada she'eno mitkayem v'od de'eno ela reshima achat isora d'rabanan miha'ika nireli. So he's like, it's true, it's not lasting, and it's only one mark. But he's like, it doesn't actually seem to me like those two combinations should be enough to knock it down to permitted. Like it should still be in the intermediate status of like, you have done something significant enough that it should be pator aval asor, saying that like this isn't less significant than writing something in mashkin, right? But the Levush also, he's on the side that the Torah and Shulchan Aruch take, which is mutar l'rshom b'tziporin al sefer, k'moshe roshmin l'siman ba'alma, she'ein zeh davar shemitkayem v'gam eino ot, aval l'rshom b'tzipornav kamin otiyot nireh li vaday asor mishum kotev, af al pi she'eno mitkayem. So Levush makes a sort of distinction. He's like, if you, with your finger, carve out sort of like symbols of letters, even if it's not Mekayem, that definitely is forbidden. That's comparable to the writing in like Meiperot. But just making a mark, he thinks that he essentially disagrees with the Bach and says that those factors combined, the fact that like it's not a letter and it's not lasting, is enough to bring you to mutar. But even though that's the
seems like an
of,
invention. Seems like he's inventing this.
Right, he's sort of doing tseruf. It's a very, Rav Ovadia's kind of approach. But the Pnei Halacha and a lot of the contemporary poskim do not like this, right? A lot of them side, which is again interesting when it's like just so straightforwardly poskined in the Shulchan Aruch, like this is totally fine. But they say no, asor lichrotz b'tziporen b'siman b'daf, right? That you're not allowed to just sort of make a scratch on a thing because hoil v'siman mitkayem. He's actually saying like it is lasting enough, which is an interesting sort of thing to say when most other people granted that it wasn't lasting. הדבר אסור מדברי חכמים, אבל מותר לקפל את זווית העמוד לשם כך, מפני שאין המטרה לכרות סימן בנייר, אלא כיפול גופו הוא הסימן. Right? That you're not trying, when I dog ear a page, that's permissible, which is very convenient because that is one of the best ways to remember something in your books on Shabbos, if you are someone who is comfortable dog earing your books. Because they're saying the point of it is not to leave any impression in the paper itself, right? That like, whereas with the srita, even if like your ultimate goal is marking your spot, and that's the main reason, it's not like for an aesthetic purpose, your goal is still to leave a mark in the paper. Whereas the dog ear, like, it's just to be able to like pick at that page, but you're not trying to leave any lasting mark in the paper whatsoever.
I agree with everything. It's terrific. I just want us to remember that there is technology in society here. People had very few books. People didn't have excess, extra paper to make a bookmark. On the other hand, books are very valuable. So putting a rosham, not matter of destruction, and that's not my point. But for us, books got more books than you can deal with. But to put a rosham is really a rosham. It's like really a rosham. And, we really feel it. And okay, and there's a terrific necessity to learn on Shabbos. So like, what do you do? So the whole thing about the dog ear is very important because you actually need an answer for that. When you can't tear up paper or have extra paper around and, et cetera, what do you do? So this is great. I'm in favor of it all.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting discussion. The next bit is very also short, but once again, I think is like a really important distinction when we talk about what the issue behind kotev is. So I think we can actually just summarize. Can anyone explain for me what's the difference between Tzovea and kotev that's outlined? When are you chayav for Tzovea versus kotev, Max?
I don't know if that was a pun, Rev Lexie, but you said
Oh,
outline.
I was not intentional, but a fun one. Yeah.
In this situation, if you sort of draw the outline of a picture, that's gonna be chaya for kosev, and then if you color it in, that's tzovea.
Right. Because, and I think Pnei Halacha does spell this out, which I think is already articulated in the earlier sources, which is that Tzovea is about aesthetics, whereas Kotev is about meaning, right? So if I just shade in an entire paper blue, then I'm chayav for Tzovea because I just wanted to color it blue. But if I draw the outline of a tree, I am chayav for Kotev because it's like a unit of meaning, right? It's not that like any painting would be Tzovea. They're like, no, like when you create essentially like a concept that you record, that's Kotev. When you change the color because you want it aesthetically to look different, that's Tzovea. Right. So this distinction, again, obviously ends up being very significant for some of the stuff we'll see next week about what constitutes kotev, like the microphone that Rav Nachum and Rav Landis were mentioning, and like photographs and things like that. The idea that it's lav dafka, literal words. We've seen this also with the Rishima, but like marking and storing a concept, essentially, as opposed to something that is like purely aesthetic. Okay. Next bit is very fun and also gets into some interesting practices from back in the medieval times. We get the questions of like cakes and books that have writing on them. And what's the issue with that, if there is one? So Reuven, do you want to read the Mordechai?
Yes, okay. Okay. נשאל לרבנו מאיר על עוגות התינוקות שכותבין עליהן אותיות ותיבות, איך אוכלים אותם התינוקות ביום טוב? So we have this question, there's a practice, which I suppose we still have today, of writing on cakes for children, letters and words. How can we eat them on Yom Tov? והשיב אם משום מוחק ביום טוב. Leka isura deoraita b'mochek, ela al manat lichtov, k'd'amrinan perek klal gadol, miha isura derabanan ika. ובתינוק אין לחוש, דקטן אוכל נבלות אין בית דין מצווין עליו להפרישו, היכא דלא ספינן בידם. Okay, so the answer is that if the concern is mochek on Yom Tov, then there's no deraita level prohibition here. Rather, the issue is kotev. And then we bring in this Gemara here, but nevertheless, there is a rabbinic level Isser. But I was a little confused about this last section here about why because these are children, there's actually no reason to be concerned. Is it because the Beis Din is not has no power over them?
It's this idea of children aren't chayav in mitzvahs yet. Children can eat like a child could consume nevelot if needed, is the idea here.
Right.
You're not supposed to be actively doing the Beit Din mitzuvin alav lehafrisho. If a child is eating nevelot, the Beit Din is not commanded to stop them from doing that because they are not formally obligated in not doing that. We are not supposed to actively, ideally, be supplying that. Which again becomes a little bit complicated in this case. I would say the whole problem is that since the nevelot themselves are usher, it's a little different as opposed to here, there's a cookie or whatever, but it's we're not necessarily telling them do mochek, right? Go erase the letters in the cookie. But the Maharam is essentially saying adults shouldn't do this. He's it is rabbinic level mochek to eat these cookies that have words in them.
I think here's a case of tziruf. I think he's saying that nevelas is to do right, and even there we don't stop them. So here, which is derabanan, because it's not almanat liktov. It's not because he doesn't want to write afterwards. It's only derabanan, so we can be even more lenient and actually give them. I think that's what.
Well,
you get the feeling that when he's thinking about this, and people have asked him this question, what are you hacking me about the kids, Really?
Yeah, they don't want to ruin their fun. It's similar to there's a whole thing in Isser V'Heter where Rabbeinu Tam is asked about, whether the chicken, something has to do with the chicken that hasn't been plucked is considered a birya or not, and it's at a wedding feast, and everybody's clearly come on, Rabbeinu Tam, if you don't say this is mutter, we've just lost our entire wedding feast. You've got to be able to find a way for this to be okay. Anyhow, but the Maharam does land on the fact of okay, it's okay that you have this practice of the kids eating them, but it's dafka because they're kids. You adults would not be allowed to do this. So Jacob, do you want to read the Sif Gimel in the Shulchan Aruch?
Sure. Hamochek dio shal klaf o shal pinkas imif bim komo kedelach tov bet otiot chayav. So one who erases dio that's on a cloth or wax that's on a receipt, I guess, receipt tablet.
A ledger, yeah.
Ledger, yeah. If there's left in his place enough to write 2 letters, he would be chayav. Aga. Asor ver uga shektav ala ha'otiot. Afal pi she'eno avein rak la'achila dehave mochek. So prohibited to break a cake that has letters written on it, even though that it's only intended for eating, since it would be erasing.
Right. So this is where the relevant bit to our subject comes in, right? The Rama, he says even just breaking it, and we'll get into a distinction later on between potentially breaking versus the actual eating itself. The Mishnah Berurah, which maybe you'll see this inside with Joel, does make a chiluk of like, oh, you can break it between the letters, right? Maybe like you should make sure not to break any of the letters themselves, but you could like break it in the spaces in between, right? So if you have a cake or something that has things written on it, be careful to like space your letters out so you could like cut in the open space and not actually erase any of the letters themselves.
This becomes relevant with opening pills on Shabbat. If you connect them, if you could take a pill on Shabbat and you have to, in order to pop the pill, it has aluminum on the back, and then there's letters there.
Mhm.
You should try to, right? I mean, I don't know if we can discuss
Right, there's
this,
a lot
but
of them. You
it's a
talk about this
similar-
not just with that, but like also with just packages. There's a lot of ones that have, again, like labels and things that will be torn if you open them. So again, generally the lichatchila advice is like you should try and, if you can, try and tear it in a way that doesn't tear the letters. But generally they're also like, most people, especially when it's something that you need, like a pill or a food that you need to access, will be like try and not tear the letters. If you did, you didn't like do an avera.
Yeah, there's a technological, like this is a big halacha question. Everyone has birthday cakes for their kids. It's like a anniversary, 50th anniversary, rabbi. You're telling me I can't do this? So when I was a young rabbi in LA, I don't think it was machadish this, but I thought of it and I was teaching these halachas. And I said, how can we do this? So I spoke to the bakers and we made a chocolate block that would say on it, happy anniversary, happy birthday, etc. And then technological solution. You take the chocolate block off and you can eat the rest of the cake. Some kid, of course, would always break the block and eat that, but that's a concept,
It's actually a good solution.
Yeah.
How it worked.
Okay. I
That's
think, well,
actually
yeah, we'll see now.
Practice here.
Yeah, so there's different ways of like managing to avoid this, even according to the stricter opinions, but we'll also see a couple other qualifications. I think we don't need to look at the Magen Avraham inside. One of the big things, this isn't even his chiddush, but he quotes someone else who mentions that maybe things are more makil if it's like something that is baked into the material as opposed to written on it, right? That like basically if there's a cookie that's been like stamped or something, right? And so there's letters that are like part of the cookie as opposed to like written on it in frosting, that is less problematic. Because you're not really erasing something that is like a letter that exists independently. But now we're going to see the Dagul Mervava getting into this. So Max, do you want to read for us? The beginning is just him quoting from Magen Avraham that like erasing images and words in these cases would be chayav.
Where do you want me to start?
So the first bit is the Bir Matchil, saying like erasing an image would be chayav. Vadai.
Vadai? Okay. Vadai dvarav nechonim, she'im yesh isor ba'osios gam b'tzura yasor, v'zeh efshar. Shaharei amru yotzin b'srikin ha'mitzuyarim b'pesach, v'arei yotzin hainu b'layla rishona shi yom tov, v'av l'chadchila lo asru asiyatan rak mishum chimutz, aval im hem kvar asuim yotzin bahem l'chadchila. So the Magen Avraham certainly right, because if there's if there's an isra on letters, then tzura should have the same din. And there's this case in Psachim of like matzahs that are shaped or made in certain shapes, which are kosher matzahs even for the first night of Pesach. Usrikina mitzuyarim hainu shemitzuyar aleihem tzuros ofos v'dagim. Okay, they would put different animals on them.
But also, again, in the thing he says about l'chachila is he mentions that like the Gemara actually says you shouldn't make those, but the reason it gives is because the women will spend so long trying to make these pretty shapes that it might end up being leavened. But he's like, that's the only concern that's mentioned. Like they're like, if you manage to make, if you make a non-leavened designed matzah, it implies that that's fine. Okay. Ve'yin Magid Mishnah.
Ve'yen Magid Mishnah Perak He Milchos Chametz V'Matzah Ulechein Im Ita Ladin Ze Al Korchach Muchrach Lios Chiluk Shel HaRabbi Shmuel HaLevi Dedavka Shekosev Midavar Acher Aval Im Hi Meha'uga Atzma Sharei V'chein Nireh La'inus Daiti. So then this is the chiluk of that we were talking about, that maybe if it's baked into the cake itself or something like that, then it's fine, as opposed to having icing on top.
Exactly.
The od nir ela'inus daiti lo mi bayi l'trumas adeshen she'hivia Magen Avraham b'siman shin yudalid sivkan hey. To be isur d'Rabbanan mutar psik reisha. Im kain mochek ze de lav almanas lichtov u rak isur d'Rabbanan bekivan she'enu miskaven mutter. So also, right, the Trumas Hadeshen brought this Magen Avraham that with an isur d'Rabbanan, that an Isser D'Rabbanan would be mutter with a psik reisha. And since this type of mochek isn't almanat lichtov, it's just because you're eating the cake, that makes it only an Isser D'Rabbanan, because it's only rises to D'Oraisa if it's almanat lichtov. And since you're not trying to erase the letters, you're just trying to eat, ela afilu l'das Magen Avraham.
But so remember, he said lo mi bai. He's like, we don't even need that opinion. You might say, oh, like, well, we'll rely on this Trumas Hadeshen to say it's okay. But he's like, no, you don't even need to say that psik reisha with the D'Rabbanan is permitted, even according to Magen Avraham Sham.
Right. Shafil b'isur D'Rabbanan asur psik reisha. Mikol makom harei heichi de'enu miskaven umekalkel ve'osek kila achar yad gam hamagen Avraham matir sham afilu b'psik reisha. Umikol shekain kan de kulhu itnuhu. We have in this case we have all of these different factors. De mekalkelhu, because it's destructive. V'gam kila achar yad de'ein derech mechika bekach. This isn't how you normally erase things, and so it's kila achar yad. Umikol shekain im eno shover biyado rak befiv derech achilato. Right, you're doing it derech achilato. It's not normal. It's not normally how you destroy things with your hands. It's happening with your mouth.
I think he has two things here. He's like, even if you were doing it with your hands and you were like breaking it or whatever, that still isn't a normal type of mochik. And he's like, kol shekain, if the only way that you're destroying it is when it's like in your mouth.
Right. V'gam isur d'Rabbanan she'enu almanas lichtov, and the factor of the d'Rabbanan, which we mentioned before, pshita de'enu miskaven mutter afil b'psik reisha. And so in this case, because you're not trying to erase the letters or the figure or whatever it is, it's mutter even though it's a psik reisha.
Right. So he's saying, like, again, the Dagul Merava is doing tzeruf, right? He's like, actually, yeah, like just to d'Rabbanan for the Magen Avraham, which we like l'chumra follow, that's if it's just d'Rabbanan, there's no other factors, it's not enough to allow a psik reisha. But if it's d'Rabbanan and it's mekalkel and it's kol acher yad, all of these things together, and it's not like a melacha she'ein tzricha l'gufa, all of these things like combined, that can bring us to mutter, even for those who don't think Rabbanan by itself is permitted with psik reisha. So lechein nireh la'aniyut dati.
Heter gamor b'davar zeh. Definitely, it's totally fine. V'chein kol ha'achronim tamhu al isur zeh rak shelo mil'u libam lehakel kivan shezeh yatsa mipi Maharami Rottenberg. Right? Everyone wanted to try and find a way out of this, but they couldn't quite. Didn't really want to go to the distance because it came out of it came from Maharam. Yen Sham b'Mordechai, or that's where it comes down. V'nireh la'inus daiti de Maharam Sham nishal al ugos hatinokos shekosvin alehen osios v'tevos eich ochlinotam hatinokos biyom tov Ian Shamba Mordechai. So the question there is specifically about these cakes that are made for children, which have words and letters on them. The kivan shekasav ugos hatinokos behei hayadiat nir ela ainuyas daiti shayu regilim lichtov bekavana sheyochleno hatinokos liskula lehischakem. So actually, there were these like special skula cakes that they made, and so they would give them to the kids as as like a as a skula, because of the Hayadiah. The Ian Be'aroch Erech HaShlishi V'im ken ze haya miskaven the gam lav mekalkel. And so this doesn't check some of the boxes that I talked about earlier, because you are miskaven to eat the cake in order to get smarter, and it's not kilkul, it's actually like some sort of, it's productive in a sense.
It's like constructive, yeah.
Right. Lachain lo hitir rak latinokos. And so in that case, that's why, because of the factors that come up over there, it's fine for children, but not for adults, but it's only for those specific skula cakes. Aval be'inyan acher muter af ligdolim. But any other normal cakes are fine even for adults. V'amachmir yachmir latzmo v'lo lacherim. And if you want to be machmir, keep it to yourself.
Yeah, don't forbid people their birthday cakes. Which again, I think is like, it's a very smart move by the Degel Merva. He's like, you actually don't even have to disagree with the Maharam Rottenberg to land on this being mutter, because there's like a chiluk there, right? Like in his case, they're like, they actually want the kids to be like eating these words, right? There's like a significance to them like consuming the words. Whereas like with a birthday cake, nobody cares about the word you're consuming. It's just there so you can look at it and it's like, oh, that's so nice. And then you're eating the cake. We don't think there's any significance to you eating like an H. And so it's a very smart distinction. I'll, for the sake of time, read and do some summarizing for this interesting Shivat HaRamah, right, where he's talking about the issue of books that have words printed along the sides, and being able to use and read these on Shabbos, right? So he says, "Asher sh'alti mimeni im mutar liftoch ulin'ol b'Shabbat sefer hakatuv alav mibachutz otiyot kederech shekotvin al asfarim mibachutz shem asfarim." Right, it says the name of the book on the side. Can you open and close it on Shabbos? V'kalamechash b'zeh mishum mochek v'kotev b'Shabbat darek shepotech lo yecholim likrot hot od ad sheyachzor linolo. Right, that you are like erasing it. You are making it not a functional word when you open it, and then you close it together, and you have made a functional readable word. Nired yesh tzedakdik behatuva dahakaimalan sofa boneh katav mashkin u'mepirot ba'avak derachim b'chol davar she'enu mitkayem pator v'yadu edachop torei de Shabbat pator balasor bar mitlat kadita sof ha'oreg ubnidon zeh afagav de'enu mitkayem katav zeh mikol makom havek tiva u'mechika. Right, again, like he's like, this obviously isn't like a lasting ketiva u'mechika, but like we've said that even if it's not mekayem lechatchila, it's aser. V'lo mahani im have mechika ma shechozer v'noelo v'kotbo. Adarabba mishum ze migragara da'atu mishum detarte ka'avid aliv tvei u'mishum mochek v'chozer v'kotev lo yitchayev. He's like, you might have thought, oh, well, because you're, you know, destroying it and then putting it back together, that makes it less bad because it's not a lasting mochek. And he's like, no, all that you're doing mochek and then kotev, right? That should be worse. That's not better. Does that eno tahamod Rabbi Shimon psik reisha v'dumya dener sh'achar hadelet da'asor lin'ol b'derech she'minana hashemen, right? That like this is a psik reisha. It is a literal guarantee that if you open the book, you're erasing the letters. So even Rabbi Shimon would still say, since it's psik reisha, it's forbidden. Right? Again, the idea of like you don't need it for its normal purpose doesn't matter, because even according to Rabbi Shimon, that's just not chayav, but it's still aser. V'odod adrabba malacha zot tzricha legufa dahat tzarich limchok ulichtov kedei liftoach ulin'ol hasefer umachar dezeh havei derech mechika uktiva ikol lemeimar asor. I think this is a bit of a weird argument, quite frankly, but I honestly interested if people want to put thoughts in the chat as to how he's understanding the gufa here, because he's like, yes, you do need this thing to happen, like in order for you to be able to read what's inside, but that's not the normal gufa of like writing and erasing. So people have thoughts, please leave them there. Because that כתב מרדכי בשם מוהר"ם על ההוגות, right? So he cites the cakes, הכתיב אותיות, תאסור לשברן ביום טוב ושבת משום מוחק, וכן משמע מדברי האחרונים במה שאסור לכתוב על השלושה מצות של פסח אותיות א' ב' ג' לידע איזה היא ראשונה, משום דכשעושה הסדר בשוברה מוחק הכתוב ביום טוב. You're not supposed to like write numbers on your matzot to remember which one is which, because you will break them on Yantif. Which again, this seems to be different than baking shapes into the matzah. Right? Seems like from all of what I've said so far, this would be usher, even though it's not intentional. And he also says, like, this is actually maybe even worse because it's sort of mochek almanat lichtov, because you erase it and definitionally you're putting it back and it's going to create something new. But now, in the next paragraph, he is like, however, despite all I've said, we can maybe find a way to permit this, which is great because people want to read their books. I think this is a really fun connection to our electricity discussion, actually, where similarly,
It's
right?
an umbrella.
Yeah, or like also it's the Rav Shlomo Rav Auerbach's argument about why
Right.
electricity is in bona. He's like, it's meant to be doing this always, right? You're not creating you're not doing a lasting thing because it is the normal, it's like a door, right? So to here, he's like, the way that you use this is constantly opening. That's the way it fundamentally functions. V'teida t'gar siman perek haboneh, hakotev al shtei luchei pinkas v'nahagin za'im zeh chayav, al shtei dapei pinkas ve'en nahagin za'im zeh pator, ופרש רש"י על לוחי פנקס של חנוונים כאין אותן של סוחרים, שיש להם לוחים הרבה חקוקים ותוכלים בשבת, אם נהגין ונקרין זה עם זה, כשכותבין על שתי שפתי הלוחין סמוכין זה לזה חייב, ומעתה יש לדקדק, אמה אתנה הכותב על לוחי פנקס לתני רבות התפה, דאפילו היו כתובים כבר אם פותח ונועל הפנקס, דהווה כתיבה ומחיקה. ידוע דאלו פנקסים עשויים, מלוכים עשויים לפתוח לנעול. אלא ודאי דאין זה מקרה כתיבה ומחיקה. He does this dikduk where he's like, Rashi says that, yeah, if you've written a letter on each of these pinkasim that can be put together and read, that you're chayav. If it were true that just the act of like putting together or separating letters was enough for you to be chayav, Rashi should have said that, yeah, even if you just put two luchot together that already have a letter on them, that you're chayav. It doesn't say that. It says if you've written them, and therefore he's like, he should have taught the greater chiddush if that were a problem. Right, yes, Scrabble. We'll get also into this. I think we won't cover it this week based off time, but we will get into the question also a bit more next week about like things being stuck into place versus just put next to one another. But I'm not going to read the entirety of this paragraph, but he basically learns out from this bit elsewhere where it also says, if you like wrote a letter in Tveria and this other one, what was the other city? In a different city, and like, then you actually are chayav. And the reason you're chayav is because it's not lacking any maaseh. The only thing it's lacking is them being brought together. And in an interesting way, even though that's the chumrah, the Ramah points out that that also works like lakula in our case, that a physical act of things being brought together that doesn't involve any like destroying or tearing, right? Like if you write letters on two different walls that aren't next to each other, like if you wanted, you could like cut out a piece of plaster and like stick it onto the other, but that's like a physical act, right? So in the absence of that physical act, they're not considered to be together. But just bringing things together that doesn't involve any other sort of like masa that changes the physicality of a thing, he proves that that's not considered a masa, right? The Gemara says that like the simple act of taking together things that are already existent is actually just not considered to be relevant, right? So ultimately, he poskins that it is in fact fine for you to read these books that have the letters on the side, because the act of just separating and bringing together things that are already existent with no sort of physical connection, just like bringing them closer together or further apart, is actually not considered to be a significant act, right? So ultimately, you do not have to fear about the printing on the side of your books, at least according to the Rama. So, shkoyach. Next week, we will look a little bit at also the
shkoyach
Scrabble
to you.
question.
Very good.
Yeah, we'll get into the question of what it means if the letters are sort of fixed in a more like physical way as opposed to just brought together, and stuff about electricity and how that, different electronics and Ketiva relate.
Thank you.
So, shkoyach to everybody.
Koach. Thank you.
Very nice sources.
Very fun.